you must expect a miracle.
You have the power of choice.
Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ.
Welcome to Life Today Live. I am Randy Robinson. Good to have you here. We're gonna hit a really hot topic today. You've probably been hearing about critical race theory, about woke culture, and you probably, like most of us, are slightly confused by what certain things mean. You hear something you like and you go, "Oh, I agree with that." And you hear something you don't like and you think, "Well, maybe I don't agree with that." Well, today's guest has authored a new book. It is available now, and I would encourage you to check it out if you want to educate yourself on the topic. It is called Awake, Not Woke, and the author is Noelle Mering. And Noelle is a fellow at the Washington, D.C.-based think tank called the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She's also a contributor at one of my favorite websites, The Federalist, as well as lots of other places. And so she's been deep into this topic, watching the effects of it, getting into sort of the ideas, and she's going to help us understand it a little bit better. Not just so we can understand truth from lies, but also so we can converse with other people and hopefully shine a little light into our world. So, Noelle, it's great to have you here on Life Today Live.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. All
right. Now, I think we need to get into definitions pretty quick here because it was G.K. Chesterton that said that what is it? Evil, I'll get the quote right. Evil always takes advantage of ambiguity. And this is one of those things where as soon as I think I've got a handle on it and I say, hey, this idea behind CRT or behind the woke movement is wrong, someone says, well, that's not what it means, and it's like, well, I swear I heard somebody say that. And you're like, prove it. Can you document that? And it's like, what? And it sort of takes the legs out from underneath. So what are we talking about when we talk about the idea of being woke?
Yeah, I think you make a great point that there is a constant moving of the goalposts and moving of the definitions that makes it really confusing. It's a large reason why I wanted to write the book. I think the most common, and perhaps maybe I could say inoffensive to any side definition would be that to be woke is to be alert and attuned to the various layers of oppression in society. It originated, the word particularly with regard to racial justice or racial issues, but it has broadened to include a whole host of, all the hot button issues, sexuality, gender, transgenderism. And so to be woke is to see that all of society is actually start filtering all of society through the lens of power. Ultimately, some groups are oppressors and some groups are oppressed, and there can be various levels of each group within each person with intersectionality. But it fundamentally is seeing all of humanity as fundamentally a power contest, in that the goal is to invert power structures. So it's a movement built with the aim of revolution, ultimately.
Oh, interesting. So now what would we disagree with on that? Because if you look through the course of history, yeah, it's power struggle after power struggle, and the winners oppressing the losers so often throughout history.
Yeah, I think the main thing to disagree with it about is that it is a real ideology in the sense that it takes partial truths and totalizes them. So it says, okay, it points to examples of injustice or narratives of injustice, and narratives are really where it gets its power, sort of stories that kind of pull at your heart because there truly is injustice there. But then it totalizes them and says, okay, this is how you see all of humanity now. And this is why we have the oversimplistic idea of identitarianism, where if you are a white, straight male who identifies as a man, you have virtually no access to seeing any of the reality of what's happening in society because you are all privilege and no oppression. And then the more oppression you can claim, the more ability you have to have positionality, what they would say. That means you're able to see the truth of what's going on better than the guy who has more privilege next to you. So the thing to disagree is that that this is a totalizing filter through which we understand ourselves. It's so overly simplistic. I mean, if you think about the nature of the human person, you can think of heroic men throughout history, or female saints, or whomever. And they can easily be dismissed by the woke based on their skin color, their genitalia, their possibly being a dominant religion. So it really is a really unnuanced perspective, and fundamentally rejects the deeply personal way in which each person walks through life and is called to be a child of God. Rather than being defined by the love of God, it asks us to define ourselves by the hatred of society. As a fundamentally opposite ways of looking at the human person and of reality itself.
All right. We get into this and we get a lot of big words. And I know people's eyes glaze over. Give us an example. And there's so many that, I mean, it should be easy, but give us an example of how that manifests itself in a way that most people can understand or even are impacted by.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so for example, in Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was in I believe it's the Rotunda a couple of years ago. And there were all these statues of people who we revere. And she pointed to one, Damien of Molokai. This was a priest who went to a Hawaiian island to die with the lepers. He went to care for them and serve them. And she said, look at this statue of this man. He is an example of white patriarchy. And I think it's amazingly reductive in that way. But I think that fundamentally what they're saying is that we have to understand ourselves as being oppressed by other groups, bad people out there, or we are oppressed by our own self-repression because we're trying to conform to some sort of sexual norm. So this is why Black Lives Matter, for example, will had in their statement of beliefs that we have to queer the culture. We have to disrupt the traditional nuclear family. Right. And I remember there's a lot of confusion in response to that. What does a movement about racial justice have to do with queering the culture and disrupting the nuclear family? But if you understand the internal logic of the movement, sexual repression is a version of political oppression for them. And so this is why there's always, I think a lot of Christians will be kind of deluded and think, I'm against racism. I want to fight for these just causes. Sure. And they don't understand that the implications behind it ultimately mean the destruction of the family and healthy, flourishing relationships between men and women, as well as children themselves. So, but this has been a part of the movement from day one. The targets of the movement have been the faith, religion, and the family life. Explicitly throughout time, every revolutionary from Marx to Marcuse knew that you have to get at disrupting the culture, the society, by way of the family, and very specifically by the role of the father. And so this is why we've seen the attack on fatherhood be so explicit, both undermining him from without and making the butt of jokes, but also undermining him within, corroding his moral authority by really introducing licentiousness in an aggressive way into our culture.
Wow. Boy, you're not kidding. We've certainly seen that. Interestingly, when they start mixing these things, like you mentioned, standing up against racism, which I think the vast majority of Americans would gladly do, but having to queer the culture at the same time, that's where in my view, they rope a lot of good people in for something that is bad. In other words, people who want to stand against racism get roped into something that also wants to queer the culture. And now they get roped. And what happens, I've seen, is that now Christians are divided against Christians. Is that on purpose? Is that strategic?
I think it's both. I think it's a strategic tactic, but I also think that it's one that a lot of goodwill people just kind of buy into. So, for example, I think one of the reasons why it's so confusing is because they start with a Christian precept, like we need to walk with the marginalized, walk with the suffering. And then they introduce into that precept, which is good, all these other conclusions that you have to accept, kind of like what you were saying, to the point where we get so confused. So for another example, there was a lot of talk about transgender story hours a couple of years ago, that there's a group that was specifically going to libraries and were aimed at, as young as 4 or 5 up to, maybe 12, 13, 14, and introducing them into transgender culture. And so, and I think the goal was that this is an anti-bullying movement. So that's the precept that they say is good. We want people to treat everyone with dignity, even if they live different lifestyles or if they are, kind of marginalized or fringy. And so that's what the ostensible goal is. But there's other goals there. One being, we want to allow, if there's a young boy or young girl in this room who might be open to this type of lifestyle, we want to introduce it to him, her, so that he or she might pursue it. But there's an even deeper goal, I think, that I go into in the book, which is that innocence for them is considered a dominance in society. So if you are not aware of these different lifestyles, then somehow that not being aware of them is a sign that it's not normal. There's not a normativity there. And so we have to corrupt innocence in a very particular way because it points to there being a good. The idea of people being innocent, having children being innocent of these types of lifestyle points to the fact that they might not be a normative type of lifestyle. And so children have to be disabused of that sort of sense of innocence and normativity at an earlier and earlier age. And so I think that's how these things get connected with justice movements, is that sexuality really becomes a matter of justice.
I think that's what I think a lot of people are seeing now. 20 years ago, if you just said, look, hey, if you're going to allow this gay pride parade in your town, pretty soon they're going to be coming for your children. They mocked you and belittled you and said, you're crazy, you're paranoid, you're whatever. And here we are literally having drag queens reading to kindergartners and some videos I've seen climb on them in an expression of tolerance or something. And there just seems to be a real sinister side of going after, going after your children kind of thing. Like they're coming for your children. Is that a paranoid idea, or are they coming for our children?
No, I don't think it's paranoid at all. And this is part of, you point to something really important, which is that a lot of the success of the movement has been built around branding. Think about like the SNL character, the church lady, or, wagging her finger. And, there's this caricature of if I oppose, people who stand up against pornography are these uptight, people, or that they're intolerant, but also not cool. And I think that the woke movement and the neo-Marxist movement that came to America in the 1930s were very aware. They write about going to Hollywood and seeing how much Americans are affected by stories and the power that popular culture and celebrity has over us. And they really specifically said, let's take this avenue of media and control and use it for our own ends. So movies should not be about, for example, It's a Wonderful Life. If that movie had a message that you accept the simplicity and the goodness of your family life, being in a small town, rather than your big dreams of, moving to the city and just living this more glamorous life, that to them was the worst of popular culture. No, art is for change. So movies have to be about oppression narratives. Children's stories have to be about oppression narratives. I mean, you see in the Shrek, the musical Shrek, they are the ones who have the song that says, "Fly your freak flag." The movie Frozen, I took my kids to see that. Within a few minutes, I thought, oh, this is a gay pride movie. It's so clearly an analogy for coming out of the closet in so many various ways. And I go into that in the book too. But this narrative of, embracing how you're unconventional can be good if you're talking about, I have too many freckles, or I have crazy hair, or, I'm really short or something. But the sheer ubiquity of that storyline in children's narrative stories over and over again points to this reality that they really were savvy in knowing that if you can convince people, and children especially, that to be a hero in society is to be a marginalized, unconventional, transgressive person, ultimately, then you can further their aims of revolution quite concretely and effectively.
Yeah, and I think nowhere is it seen more clearly than in what's going on with the Disney Corporation, which is really sad because Walt Disney was actually a very good man, and there are a lot of people below the line on those films and those projects who have good, solid values, and some of them have come out and spoken out. But it's quite disturbing what's going on, and whether it's corporations funding this or expressing it, I don't know. I never thought I would see this, and I thought that a lot of the conservatives and the Christians were a little paranoid. Apparently, I was wrong. Anyway, we're talking to Noelle Mering, and this is her book, Awake, Not Woke. It is available now. You can get that at theologyofhome.com or wherever you buy books. And I would really recommend it because they're coming after you. And there's one thing that you talk about in the book, Noelle, that I found pretty interesting, because I think as Christians, we fundamentally, and as Americans, we pull for the underdog. That's why we love so many of these great movies, from Hoosiers to Miracle, the sports analogies especially, but all these Rocky, it's an underdog story. I think good people naturally want to end oppression. They want to empower those who have been oppressed. They want to extend a hand to help someone up, and I think that's good, But what you're saying is that the woke movement does not really empower the oppressed; it weakens them. How does it do that?
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, that was one of my main motivations for writing the book, is just that it became clear that they are harming the very people they claim to want to help. And I think you're right that Christians have rooted for the underdog traditionally. And I think that's with the idea that the underdog can actually triumph over his circumstances, or he can surmount seemingly insurmountable odds. That's a story that we all love because it fundamentally is. It is Christ's story, there's no one who's been a greater victim than our Lord, and he is the ultimate victor. So, but the woke movement has a fundamentally different aim. They actually have to conceal the victimhood for them, for the movement, both supports their power and also conceals it. It hides it. So, for example, when every corporation has to email me in June to tell me how we're all celebrating Pride Month together, when our embassies across the world are flying the Pride flag, when we've effectively tarnished the American flag as being, in many people's minds, now a symbol of racism, who actually has power in this country? And yet it always has to be with a posture of victimhood, because there is a difference between walking with someone who's suffering and someone who it reminds me, if you've ever known someone with a narcissistic personality disorder, it's always about their hurts, their injuries, without ever the ability to triumph over them or to struggle against them or to accept their own responsibility. I'm not saying that the woke have a personality disorder, but it mimics.
I'll say it.
Tendency. Yeah. I think they encourage personality disorders in people. I will say that. I think the movement encourages a personality disorder.
And I mean, certainly, aren't we encouraging gender dysphoria?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Abigail Shrier wrote a great book called Irreversible Damage. About 10 years ago, there were almost no girls with gender dysphoria, and now it's exploded. And that's not because all of a sudden we've just recognized a reality we didn't see before. It's because I think we're actually encouraging and introducing this possibility into the ecology of our children. It becomes all of a sudden a shortcut to virtue. You can claim this mantle of this sort of dysphoria or this being in this particular group. All of a sudden, you have this new heroism about you that I think all of society is beginning to identify. And it gives a motivation it gives a perverse incentive, I think, for a lot of girls who have other problems, and those problems are not being addressed. They're all swept under the rug for the sake of this little shortcut to transgenderism.
There's something I'm not sure if you deal with it in your book or not, but I know you've seen it. And that is this weird obsession with symbols. Are you familiar with the university up somewhere in the Midwest where they removed a rock from their campus because apparently back in the, 30s, 40s, 50s, somewhere way back, someone in a campus newspaper used the N-word to describe the rock. Now, I don't know the whole story there, but from what I read, the rock itself did nothing wrong. And there was no officialdom to it, but they gravitated to the symbol, and they removed this rock, which evidently had some bearing to the university and its roots in geological studies. And I kind of got it when they went after, Robert E. Lee or something. I get it. He led the forces in the South. Fine. The Confederate flag, I never understood why people down in my part of the nation would fly the battle flag of a losing army, so I kind of, but then it's like, now we're going to tear down Abraham Lincoln statues. Okay, I don't get that. And now we're to the point where we're removing rocks. Yet, the symbol that has stood the longest for slavery, for Jim Crow, for oppression, has been that donkey that represents the Democrat Party. So if ever there was a symbol of oppression in America, it is the Democrat Party, but we allow that to stand. So it seems very selective. Have you thought much about this weird obsession with certain symbols?
Sure. I mean, they're not tearing down statues of Margaret Sanger quite as much, or right. Karl Marx. There's still busts of him around.
Yeah.
I think there's a few things happening here. I think it's not even so much about the statue or that bronze bust or that, whatever, that rock even. It's about destroying the thing that it represents. So the idea that, for example, with the Founding Fathers, the idea that we have a unifying narrative as Americans, that there's something that we have a common story that unites us. That's one of their enemies, because they don't want things that unite us. This movement is all about rupture and what divides us, and identifying what divides us as being far more important than what unites us. But secondly, I think it's a rejection of anything to revere, that there are heroes that we can identify, or that there is a standard. It's similar to the way in which they want to get rid of objectivity in math. I don't know if you've heard this, but now they say 2 + 2 can equal 5. It's similar to even to the destruction of statues, where it's like, there's nothing outside of ourselves. There's no measure. And if there's no measure, then all of our life circumstances can be attributed to the oppression, the power structures outside of myself. There's no measure I need to meet. There's no hero that I need to revere and strive to emulate. There's no authority, ultimately. There's nothing higher than us. And that introduces a type of chaos and destabilization into society. But you see this in Maoist China, right? What did they do? They tore down statues, burned books. Yeah. This sort of destruction is commonplace and a presupposition of the revolution that is trying to follow it.
Yeah, well, and I don't think you're speaking in theoretical terms of what could happen. I think you're describing what obviously is going on and has been going on, arguably, I think, since, well, I mean, you can go back pretty far, but definitely since the 60s, but has really taken off at a it's like the pace has accelerated exponentially over the last 10 years or so. But we're living it. The revolution is here. And so I think it's a question for us as to what we're going to do with it, sit idly by or get involved in some way. And actually, I want to end with talking about that. But there's one more point that you make, Noelle, that I think is very important. And once people understand it, I think it shines a lot of light onto what is going on, because there's a difference between critical thinking and critical theory. And most people, if you said, what's the difference, they couldn't tell you. They wouldn't know. They hadn't even thought about it. But I think this is key in understanding what is good in critical thinking and what is dangerous in the critical theory that we're seeing being implemented from corporations to sports arenas to Disney movies for kids. Explain to us the difference and what's good and what's not good.
Sure. So I think the simplest way to distill the difference is that critical thinking has the goal of truth. You're trying to arrive at the truth when you're a critical thinker. Therefore, you invite criticism, you invite objections, you want to strengthen your own argument or see where you might have a blind spot, because you simply are seeking the truth. Critical theory has not truth as its goal, but power. And so what flows from the critical theorist does not invite objection, does not invite criticism. It eagerly offers it out. So the critical theory was really based on some Marxists who came over from Germany and started the Frankfurt School in America. I go into this in the book. And that's really where the critical theory began. So when people talk about critical race theory and they say, oh, it's not founded in Marxism, well, it's simply and explicitly in the history is. It's just one version of critical theory. And critical theory's goal is to criticize all that is with the idea of destroying it. So these are fundamentally different goals. And, there was a really important essay that was written about critical theory in the 60s about how we have to silence dissent. And you see this throughout the woke culture. And someone disagrees with the woke movement, they have to be canceled. They have to be censored.
Yeah.
They have to be silenced, because this is fundamentally an ideology. It's built on a lie. And the greatest threat to a lie is somebody pointing out the truth.
Okay, speaking of, now cancel culture is some vast right-wing conspiracy. And things that we see are happening. And we know they're happening, but then we're told, no, it's not happening. And there's the term gaslighting from the old movie and old play, where they're just subtly shifting things on you to where you start to question your own sanity. And then there's, I think, a great C.S. Lewis quote. Well, there's lots of those, but there's one about how when everyone is rushing towards the cliff, the one man running away seems insane. What is going on with what we know we're seeing, but we are constantly told, no, you're not seeing that. I mean, it's a gaslighting to a degree that I don't know if I've ever seen before. And you do start to question, am I the crazy one here?
Yeah, I think that's so important. Just even understanding it in the way you just articulated it is so helpful for people to really understand and to know that other people are feeling that too. So, for example, CNN just had an article where the reporter said, there's no scientific consensus that can determine if a baby is born a boy or a girl. And think about the degree of dominance that is trying to dominate over the readers. Every person reading that knows, and it's the example of what a girl is, what a baby is born, if it's a boy or a girl. And what they're saying is you cannot trust your ability to access the truth. You cannot trust yourself. And so what you're pointing to is exactly the goal, introducing such confusion, such self-doubt that we become easily controlled, that we don't trust ourselves to know what is real and what is not. And so we need someone woke shepherding us to what the right belief is, what the acceptable proposition is.
Yeah, and I want you to talk about that. Of course, when you talk about CNN, this is the same network that yesterday from Kabul said they're shouting death to America, but they're mostly peaceful. What are you talking?
Friendly. Yeah.
Friendly, is that the word? They're mostly friendly. And so, yeah, insanity going on. Here's the ultimate question for all this, and what everybody needs to hear who's watching right now. And by the way, thank you guys for being a part of this. Great comments in the chat, and for sharing this. Wonderful. If you haven't subscribed or followed, please do that. What, Noelle, do we do to fight this? What do we do about this?
That's the important question. So I think that there's various layers to it. I think every person can find some way in which the circumstances of their life allow them to resist this in a way that costs us something, but it's still within the realm of prudence, right? Obviously, every father cannot walk into their company and blow up the whole woke movement and get fired. But we cannot go along with a lie at the same time. We have to have places where we cannot go and lie, and we cannot participate in lies. So there will come a place where we have to resist this really at cost to ourselves. Secondly, I think that we can support organizations that are fighting this. We can support alternative media, your show, for example, my books. There's new coffee companies that are anti-woke. We should be giving our money to these new institutions and supporting them. But thirdly, I think that we need to really understand what is happening, because as we've been talking about throughout this interview, it operates on confusion. And that's why I wrote the book, to help people get clarity. And once we have clarity, then it gives us courage. And we are going to need courage, because it's a very intimidating movement that seeks to play on your fear of being portrayed as a bad person, your fear of being silenced. And I think that type of fear has power the more that we allow it to have power. And the more people who are standing up and simply and plainly resisting this, the more courage we'll all be able to have. And finally, most importantly, I think anything we do out in the world has to be an overflowing of our interior life of prayer. And that really, this is a movement that will be defeated by Christ. And it's his power, not ours, that can defeat it. We can't they're based on rage. We cannot meet rage with rage, but rather with the courage, truth, and love of our Lord.
Yeah. Oh man. And you just said something that reminded me of a quote that I'm gonna look. You had a great quote because you said we need to be careful because we don't become the thing that we hate. And I want to find it because it was so great. Shoot. I can't find it. Oh, it's in your notes. I so apologize.
That's okay.
It's just it was such a great one, and I should have highlighted it. And hatred for an ideology, and this is from Noelle's book, by the way, okay? Hatred for an ideology can easily become hatred for the person espousing it. And this would be the triumph of the very thing we think we are fighting. There's so many great quotes out of this book. I got lost in my notes. But that is exactly it. And Noelle, I appreciate you saying that. When you say we can't go, blow up the woke culture, you mean that metaphorically, not literally, But it is important that we do not become the thing we're fighting. And when they're feeding us poison, if we taste a little bit of it, it can make us sick, but we cannot become that. So I appreciate it. Thank you, by the way. We could keep going, but you guys just need to pick up the book. It will really help you understand and arm you in this fight that you are already in. You don't have a choice. So Noelle, thank you so much for sharing with our audience and for putting the hard legwork into explaining this to us, arming us, and pointing us in the right direction. I appreciate you.
I appreciate you inviting me on. Thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate you guys hanging out and watching a little Life Today Live. We've got more. I encourage you to pick up, obviously, the book. This is the book we're talking about. It is called Awake, Not Woke. It is available. You can get it wherever you get books. And I certainly recommend picking it up at this website. It looks like this, theologyofhome.com. You can also follow Noelle at noellemaring.com. And we're in it, people, so let's get in it. And part of what we do here at Life Today is try to arm you, try to give you the spiritual roots, but also the information and education you need. So come back, and we will do it again next time here on Life Today Live.
I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop.